Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. This is not a peace plan, but rather conditions for surrender. Those were the words by Riyad al-Maliki, the Palestinian foreign minister at the United Nations. He was reacting to what has now come out, seemingly, of the Middle East peace plan presented by Jared Kushner and Jason Greenblatt. It is not yet, of course, being released to the public or even released to the two parties in full, but there have been leaks of sorts. Now, this peace plan obviously seeks to create peace between the Israelis and Palestinians. Jared Kushner has already made it clear that he does not want to even talk about a two-state solution. And then obviously there are other concerns as well about Israel having military control, even possibly over any future Palestinian state, if there is to be one under this plan. To discuss all of this a bit further, we're now joined by Ahmad Al-Bazz, who is a Palestinian photojournalist and documentary filmmaker. He is joining us now from Nablus in the West Bank. We're also joined by Fahad Muhamed Altaher, who is a Palestinian left-wing activist. He's also a political analyst, and he is joining us now from the Jordanian capital, Amman. Fahad and Ahmad, thank you both for joining us. Fahad, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of this peace plan, what we've understood about it so far, and Palestinian officials' reactions to it?
Well, thank you very much for having me, Waqar. Actually, after more than 25 years with Oslo, that has been proved to be a conduit to seize more lands and build more settlements. The Americans now are trying to put forward rather a surrender document. Trump's deal is actually an Oslo agreement that has grown viscerally ugly. However, we cannot separate what is happening here in Palestine with what's going on with other fronts around the world. I know this might sound very different than what is being said about in the media. However, I strongly believe that the deal of the century actually is an American military move rather than a political one. This is why I'm not taking the piles of leaks about it too seriously. The existence of Israel depends on the military and economic support of the United States. And without sugarcoating the reality with diplomatic phrasing, the true genesis of the so-called deal of the century is actually an American solution to reduce its military and economic burden, to continue having Israel with lesser expenses, by offsetting military threats surrounding it through a comprehensive peace plan. It should also be noted that the American regime is trying to immensely pressure all sides to accept this deal right now to have enough space and energy, countering the emerging multipolarity with the rise in Russian and Chinese powers, which would consume a lot of American vigor, if I may use this term, politically, financially, and I'm not overstating when I say militarily as well.
Okay, so if I may, I'd like to bring Anna on this as well, Fahad. Ahmed, what do you make of that sitting in the West Bank? Because there is concern as well about annexation and on other such topics within this peace plan. Of course, we don't know the details specifically right now. We just know of rumors, essentially, and leaks. But what are your thoughts about that?
So first of all, I don't think that Israel is interested in annexing the West Bank. They maybe are interested in annexing West Bank settlements, which means settlers, Israeli settlers, but without Palestinians, because nobody here in the region is interested in giving Palestinians like citizenship rights or other rights. So this is not an option, I believe. But for this deal, I believe it is like a clear American position finally after eras of previous US-American presidents who were unclear about their position. Mr. Trump is finally making himself very clear, and he's an honest man. This is his fame here in the Palestinian territory, by the way. Like, he's a controversial person, but at least he's honest about his position towards the Palestinian-Israeli issue. And nobody is interested anymore to keep having this issue open forever. So what we have here in the Palestine-Israel region is a temporary condition that has been existing since at least 1967. And now they want to make the temporary situation a permanent one by having this nice, I can say, American nice deal, which is to give Palestinians more autonomy in the West Bank without having the idea of a state, the sovereign state.
Okay. All right, so if I may come in, Ahmad, to ask Fahad. Fahad, Ahmad there made a good point that this needs to be settled at some point in time, doesn't it? And now that we have, as Ahmad there correctly put it, and you can disagree, of course, if you want, that Donald Trump is at least being honest. He is pro-Israel, and he is very openly pro-Israel. He is not making any secrets about it either, or he's not even trying to pretend like he's neutral in this case. Do you think that it's good to have such honest discussions even with the United States?
Well, it should be clear that whatever done by the United States, it has an evangelical biblical background, and Palestinians also religiously committed to Al-Aqsa. This is the core and the heart of the issue. It's undeniably a holy war for both sides, and we have been fighting since 1916, and our fight became politically official in 1948, and we have been fighting ever since, and we overcame countless situations where our military power has not even been able to make a statement. But Trump just showed the reality of what's going on in the White House. This is exactly what he did. Otherwise, it has been the same play all along since 1916, and it never changed.
So Fahad, I wonder then if you're saying that this has not changed as such, then will this work? Will this plan work? Can this plan even appease the Palestinians?
No way. This is absolutely not going to work, and according to the current situation right now on the ground, I can tell you that we are approaching the end game here. We are approaching the end game here. The Israeli military it cannot fight anymore, according to the Israelis themselves. And if I can have a few minutes to explain to you a very important report done by Yitzhak Brick, and he is the a high official in the military army who have met more than 1,400 military units and thousands of soldiers. He said the report is long, and I don't want to take all of your time, but the point of this report: the Israeli army cannot conduct any ground invasion. Not on Gaza, not on the West Bank, not on the South Lebanon, not even able to keep the Golan Heights. So the United States is trying to reduce its military burden, and when they announce such plan, I am sure that it's going to outbreak another intifada, because it has been simmering all along, and I believe it's about time that we will have a third intifada.
Okay, so Ahmad, look at the plan that was leaked by Israel Hayom, the Israeli newspaper. It included a few details which I wonder what you make of them. That a new Palestine will be established in the West Bank and Gaza, with the exception, as you had also mentioned, Ahmad, of the settlements that are on Palestinian lands in the West Bank. Will that be acceptable to Palestinians?
So for Palestinian people, any solution that does not include the right of return of millions of Palestinian refugees according to the UN General Assembly Resolution 194 is not accepted. For the majority of Palestinians here, it's a settler colonial case, which is mainly about demography and geography. And without having these people coming back to the places, it's not accepted. And as we can guess, this can never be one of the points in the deal of the century. And for them, any solution that will not bring equal rights for everybody living between the Jordan River and the sea is not also accepted. So the points will be revealed in mid-June, according to the press. but we are expecting more autonomy and more authority on some areas in the West Bank where we can operate as a sub-state. But this is not bringing what Palestine is aspiring to, which is a decolonization for the situation that we have here, but it is just making it a bit better. I don't think it is going to be acceptable, and I don't think it's going to be applied.
Very well. We're going to go into a very short break now. We'll be back, viewers, with the rest of this topic and discussion after that break. Please stay tuned for that. Viewers, we're still here in Scope, and we're continuing to discuss what we have understood so far coming out of leaks about any Middle East peace plan that the United States may have. And of course, we had the Palestinian foreign minister reacting to it, saying that this plan is essentially a Palestinian surrender. It's not really giving the Palestinians what they want. To take forward this conversation in this segment, we're still joined by Ahmad Al-Bazz, who is a Palestinian photojournalist. He's joining us still from Nablus in the West Bank, but we're also adding a voice. We're now joined by Mr. Gideon Levy, who is a journalist, and he is joining us from Tel Aviv. Gideon, I wanted to get your thoughts on, from what we've understood now about these leaks that have come out by Israel Hayom and other such sources about this possible plan. Do you think it is, as Riyad al-Maliki said, a Palestinian surrender?
Yes, because there is no other way to see it. When you see what the United States had done until now, this administration, in order to humiliate the Palestinians as much as they could, and really to bring them to a position which they've never been before, with recognizing Jerusalem, moving the embassy, recognizing the occupation of the Golan Heights, and many other things. But this is a very clear message to the Palestinians. Also, I must say, the personal figures who are cooking this kind of deal, they are all Zionist, Jewish, and pro-settlers, not only Zionists and Jews, but really right-wingers that even in Israel are perceived as right-wingers. So you don't expect this combination of a president like Donald Trump, who has nothing to do with the weak ones, with human rights, with justice, with values, with international law, and his mediators, who are all Zionist Jews, right-wingers. You don't expect anything fair to come out from this deal.
Indeed, and Ahmed, one of the interests that's come out of this, from what we've understood, is that even Jared Kushner, Ahmed, had said that Palestinians would have a better economy going forward. He seemed to want to concentrate on the economic conditions of Palestinians' development, investment, etc. Will that be enough, do you think, Ahmed, to make some Palestinians happy?
I don't think this is the core point of our case here in Palestine-Israel region. It's not about economy. Our horrible economic situation is one of the consequences of the situation that we have. So it's a result. It's not the main point. And I think the demands, all of the demands, are mainly political ones. So it's not going to work with the Palestinian population, I believe. So, any solution that will not bring the fundamental rights of Palestinian people according to the United Nations resolution is not going to be accepted.
And then, Gideon, I wonder what you make of that it seems like Kushner at some level believes that just throwing money at the problem will solve it?
I think you know it very well from your own history. Colonialism always thought that with money he can buy anything. And we know how colonialism ended. I mean, Israel is maybe the last remain of colonialism in the world today, and it will not work here. The economical situation is calling for aid, is in Gaza in terms of a catastrophe, and in the West Bank in terms of a crisis. But solving the economical problems will not bring any solution for the long run. And I'm quite amazed that people don't learn from history and repeat the same mistakes again and again. Money will buy 5 or 10 years of peaceful days, but not more than this.
And then Gideon, if I may stick with you, another huge factor here is the fact that the Palestinian leadership has not officially been even brought into this process because, Trump's shut down the Palestinian Authority's offices in Washington, D.C. So how does that work exactly? Who exactly is America thinking Israel will be negotiating with and or signing any peace plan with if the Palestinian Authority is not even involved?
They believe that with the pressure of Saudi Arabia and the pressure of the United States, the Palestinians will have no other choice but to surrender. But they read it in a very wrong way, I must say, because there is a certain stage in which despair brings you to a situation in which you have nothing to lose. And I think the Palestinians are very close to this situation in which they have very little to lose. You see, until now, the PA, which I'm not a great fan of, but the PA is maybe the only so-called government in the world who said a very clear no to the White House. Who else said such a no like them? This takes some courage, and I don't see they have any other choice.
Ahmad, I wonder what your thoughts are on that when it comes to the fact that the Palestinian Authority is not even part of this process. Can any peace plan come forward without even the Palestinian leadership, whether we like it or not, being involved in the process?
Yes, so this is a very interesting and funny point. If you want to impose a solution from outside without having the main party getting involved in the details. But I should mention here that the PA is not a great body for Palestinians. So they are not in love with the Palestinian Authority, by the way. So for them, the PA is a very easygoing body that gave up so much for Israel, and they based their discussion based on the 1967 borders. And despite all of that, they couldn't achieve anything. So it is very funny for the Palestinian population that despite all of these givings that you gave for Israelis and Americans, and you went into negotiations for more than 20 years, and by the end of the day, you are not having even the minimum, which is not accepted here for the population, which is the two-state solution. So it's a very weird deal. So that's why I don't think it's gonna work, because at least you have the PA is not okay with that. The Palestinian people are not okay. And I think we are gonna hear some more reactions from the West as soon as we have the details revealed in mid-June. So it's born dead, as somebody commented on it.
Yes, Ahmed, I wonder, if Mahmoud Abbas and the PAs are so weakened because of their own political stances, do you think that is why they're being able to be strong and courageous on this specific issue? As Gideon there said, this is essentially, one of the few rare times that somebody around the world has said no very clearly to the United States.
I think because they know that they have given so much so far for the Israeli party. So by having the minimum of demands and you still not having that achievable, for sure you are going to have this reaction from the Palestinian Authority, because nothing of the basic rights for Palestinian population is brought up by this deal.
And Gideon, I wonder, I was reading an article, basically its gist was that why should Netanyahu sign on to any peace plan? He's in a position right now where he's has an ever more right-wing government, which he really needs to rely on those coalition partners to remain in power if he wants to remain in power. So what exactly is at stake for Netanyahu? would he ever want to go into a peace plan, regardless of how much of a surrender it still may be for Palestinians?
He wouldn't. By all means, he wouldn't. Netanyahu doesn't believe in any kind of peace or any kind of settlement with the Palestinians. He believes that the status quo, mainly that the occupation continues, should continue also forever in his view. He would give some partial rights to the Palestinians, far from any kind of equality or justice. And he believes that this can last forever. And I must tell you that the experience of the last decades shows that this might be possible if the world will continue to be indifferent and the Arab world will continue to ignore and the Palestinians will continue to be so weak and divided. This might last for many more years.
All right, so we're going to leave that as our final word, but of course we appreciate all of our guests for their time and insight. We were joined there by Mr. Gideon Levy, who is a journalist. He was speaking to us from Tel Aviv. We were also joined by Ahmad Al-Bazz, who is a Palestinian photojournalist and documentary filmmaker. He was speaking to us from Nablus city in the West Bank. And earlier we were joined by Fahad Muhamed Altaher, who is a Palestinian left-wing activist and political analyst. He was speaking to us from the Jordanian capital, Amman. Now, I guess as all of our guests our experts spoke about, really neither side really has much interest in having such a peace plan going forward. Netanyahu, as I put to Gideon, has an ever more right-wing coalition, which he depends on. What really does he get from signing on to a peace plan, even if the Palestinians view it as a surrender? The Palestinian Authority is not even involved in this process. It's been sidelined completely. So who exactly will this peace plan even be signed with? Will the Palestinian people even sign on to this with the leaks that we've understood right now, with that sort of structure where there may not even be a proper Palestinian state, but just autonomy in certain areas? So a sub-state, really. Is that acceptable to the Palestinians, especially considering they've been fighting for their own homeland for such a long time, to regain their own lands, I should say? So we'll keep a close eye on that situation and see how that develops going forward here in Scope. I'll be back, though, after a short break with our next segment. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. We're still here in Scope. Now, President Donald Trump has said, oddly, I may add, that U.S.-China relations remain very strong, in his opinion, despite the two countries being embroiled in what can be only termed really a trade war. Talks between Washington and Beijing are continuing, even though the deadline has passed on Friday for them to reach the agreement. As a result of the deadline passing, the U.S. has now increased and raised tariffs to 25% from 10% on goods from China, that raising tariffs on $200 billion worth of Chinese imports. And in fact, now there's talk of $300 billion of Chinese imports being tariffed as well. So to discuss all of that a bit further, we're now joined by our esteemed panelists. So we're joined firstly by Winnie, who is a lecturer in East Asian political economy and international relations at the University of Bristol. She's joining us from Bristol itself. We're also joined by Wong Shun, who is the editor-in-chief of the Oxford Political Review, and he's joining us from Oxford itself in the UK. And finally, we're joined by Dickson, who is a doctoral fellow at George Washington University, a Sigler Center of Asia. He is joining us from Washington itself. Dickson, Brian, and Winnie, thank you all for joining us. Winnie, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of these increase in tariffs, more than double, really? This will have a huge impact, won't it?
I would say yes, fundamentally for two reasons. I think there's a key domestic rationale as to why Trump has taken this line, and that is in the run-up to the presidential campaigns for 2020. Trump needs to secure his position with regards to his main block of voters. While they are agricultural in nature, many would claim, commentators would claim that this is quite contradictory to what he's trying to do, but the American government has come out to say that, and Trump has actually tweeted about the fact that he is going to provide more support, and that the brunt of these tariffs will not hit his voter base. That how much they're willing to spend to purchase, agricultural products is quite significant. With regards to international relations, from the Chinese side, we can definitely see that the Chinese are quite concerned about the fact that they cannot trust and rely upon the negotiations that are coming out of the talks with Trump's trade team. And so the fact that Trump is willing to escalate things is quite disconcerting. Xi Jinping has made it clear that he is not particularly happy, and he's also quite concerned about the fact that we tried to make concessions. We were quite proactive in making concessions. And now that Trump in his presidency is taking this position, he wants to basically hold firmer on that line.
Yeah, that's a very good point there you're making. I mean, what do you make of that? Because it does seem like, as much as China keeps saying and reacting, I should also say credit to them in a very mature and calm fashion, it seems that Trump wants ever more, doesn't it?
So I think the primary issue here with Trump is twofold. First of all, he clearly, in many cases, he thinks he understands what he's doing when he's playing his cards of basically brinkmanship, because he believes that the more he pushes China, the more China budges. But I think what it's worth noting here is that China's compromise and room for compromise is constrained by both economic rationality and its own capacity, but also the very simple fact that I think in this day and age, for America or for USA to believe they can get away with this sort of aggressive bellicose pushing against China is frankly ridiculous. And it's ultimately not in China nor the US's interest for the trade war to persist and continue and escalate. And in fact, my prediction is Trump, within 2 to 3 weeks' time, would actually have a pivot or a turning point where he reneges upon his recent hardening of his stance simply because of the unsustainability in the long run for the US economy, especially members of the Rust Belt states and members of his electorate and voter base, for the trade war to persist. So I think whilst the rhetoric is strong at the moment from Trump, it's not going to last. And I think Xi Jinping's kind of calm display of his deck of cards, or half display of his deck of cards, is certainly a tactful maneuver. I would nevertheless caveat that we should avoid projecting too much moralism and moralization of both sides' actions, because ultimately it's a trade war. It's not a cup of tea or a tea party, shall we say. Yeah.
All right, so Dickson, what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that, as Brian there said, it would not surprise us, would it, considering Trump's track record, that he may very well backtrack on some of the rhetoric that he's currently using when it comes to the trade war, because he's already saying that the relationship, though, with Xi Jinping is very good. So even though he's putting, more than doubling tariffs on Chinese imports, he says relations with China are very good. What do you make of that, Dickson?
I think my esteemed panelists have actually covered quite a bit of ground with regards to the domestic situation in the U.S., as well as what Beijing is prepared to put up with. I think I'd like to offer a little bit in terms of what the political psychology of the bipartisan consensus is on China right now. Regardless of whether Trump stays in power, regardless of whether or not it appeals to its base, there is a bipartisan consensus with regards to how the treatment, DC's treatment to China. And even though the tactics with regards to the trade war are, in a certain sense, quite crude, and to a lot of economists and econometricians, there is actually no trade basis for these tariffs. In fact, tariffs are considered a tax, and this is actually economics 101. But the thing is, there is very much of a bipartisan consensus with regards to a hardening of position towards Beijing.
And so why do you think that there is that hardening? Is that more to do with politics, really, or does this go back to, as Trump said, that China has been, has had an unfair advantage when it comes to trade with the U.S.?
I think what you have is a situation where a lot of people who used to do business in China, that means the U.S. business community has returned to New York and Washington, and they've been angered by the sort of situation and the sort of treatment that they've received in the last 20 years, especially after the Hu Jintao period. And if you follow by Dean, Mr. Kishore Babuvani's speeches, there's a lot of analysis with regards to how these people have turned on Beijing. And actually this community, this epistemic community of people, of businessmen, consultants, China hands, have hardened their position with regards to Beijing, and this has, in a sense, poisoned the perspective in DC as well. People who used to support quite a lot of positions that Beijing was involved in have actually sort of like reversed their position, very much so in the last 2 years. And this is not going to go away, regardless of whether Trump stays in power. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is this is only Act 1 of an unfolding series of hardening actions and, for lack of a better term, Cold War type scenario against Beijing. And we're not just, I mean, once again, the economic reasoning behind this trade war is very suspect. I think a lot of IR, IPE, as well as economists can agree on that.
Okay, so if you allow me, Dickson, I wanted to do that to Winnie. Winnie, I wanted to get your thoughts on this. Do you think this does have to do with the economy, or does this in fact have to do with more geopolitics and political disagreements between China and the U.S., not just in that region necessarily, but really around the world in some key areas?
I mean, it's a good question. I think the key thing that we need to remember is the fact that when it comes to the idea of having a trade war between China and the U.S., this is something that commentators, academics, politicians, policymakers have been predicting for decades. As China's economy has risen and dominated, the idea that the World Bank predicted in around 2010 that China will become the world's largest economy by 2030, this caused a lot of concern within the American elite.
Indeed.
The thing that we need to understand, though, is that a key thing that we're seeing that's fundamentally different in terms of what's happening right now is that we're actually seeing a significant shift away from the traditional kind of ideological push and pull that we traditionally see with regards to, say, in America, the Republicans and the Democrats. The Democrats have not responded negatively towards Trump's call for tariffs, right? And so what we're actually seeing is we have to remember that Trump is a salesman, and he may say, China is horrible to us, they've taken advantage of us, but we have really good relationships. It's actually not contradictory if you look at how he governs and how he sells things. The idea of a Cold War, while has some basis, I actually think that a big thing that we're forgetting is the fact that Trump is protectionist. And Trump is actually fighting for the whole Make America Great Again line. He is not pushing for America to be the leader of the free world anymore. And you can see this resulting in, and you asked about the implications for the international system. You can see this resulting in terms of rivalries, traditional alliances falling apart. So the G7 calling concerns about the fact that Italy wants to join the BRI, the fact that very, very muted response from the British government, the fact that Pompeo was here in London, talking about how Britain needs to fall in line with American approach, and yet Philip Hammond did go to the BRI summit forum and say that UK is very interested in joining the BRI. Yeah. Italy is very interested in receiving funding from the AIIB, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, because Europe is not willing to provide that support. And most significantly is the fact that New Zealand is also voiced their interest in voicing joining the BRI, calling into question for both the UK and New Zealand not their commitment, but the implications for what this means for the intelligence side with regards to the Five Eyes. Yeah. And so the strategic lines that we're seeing here in terms of the idea of the traditional neoliberal system is actually seeing more of a transformation, not necessarily led by China, but in response to what China is doing for its own objectives.
Very interesting point there. And if you allow me, Winnie, I wanted to put that to Brian, because, Brian, I wonder if you agree with that, because as Winnie there correctly pointed out, the Belt and Road Initiative, a lot of countries, or I should say some countries, slowly now signing on, Western countries I'm talking about specifically here, signing on to that initiative. Many other countries around the world already have, in other parts of the world, I should say. How do you think all of that plays out into this? Is the U.S., if I may use the word hegemony, or that unipolar world, is the U.S. finally coming to realize that that is now over, and it's sort of, in some ways, acting out?
So I think the way I'd read it actually is it's worth noting that the Belt and Road Initiative represents a sort of new era in Chinese politics, where historically speaking, we look at these 1970s or sort of 1970s and 80s. That's a period of economic liberalization. 90s to the early 21st century, that's a period characterized by internal consolidation and rapid growth and whatnot. So it's the narrative of strength, what in Chinese is known as 自强, the ideology of self-bolstering. And I think at the turn of the decade into 2010s, the BRI and also AIB and all of these various other projects that China is pushing definitely symbolizes China's intention and desire to take up a more active role in both global leadership and governance. And we see that in the discourses propagated by Xi Jinping, the whole connection between the China dream to a global rise of China and whatnot. Is the American reaction to this therefore one of lashing out? I'm not entirely sure, in the sense that it's easy to read it as a form of backlash, but I'd propose two alternative interpretations, actually. The first is the view that this is an acceptance of American decline. And I think this is something that Jeffrey Sachs, when we were having our conversation a while back, 2 weeks ago, kind of flagged and mentioned in his thoughts. He felt that there's an inevitable decline in American hegemony. And in fact, it's a wise move on the part of Trump to turn to isolationism or the consolidation of American internal capacity and economic strength, because that's kind of like the survivalist or the realpolitik strategy it could take in cutting its losses in face of the inevitable rise of China. I would add on to that, though, I think there's a second interpretation that maybe we're just overcomplicating the way we're reading the situation, that instead of seeing this as a structuralist paradigmatic shift in American policy, it might be worth for us to consider this as a reflection of strongman personalistic politics, that obviously Trump has a lot of structural forces underlying his movements, but at the very same time, he is a guy who's trying to win the 2020 re-election bid, right? And this is ultimately the best way for him to demonstrate his strength. And there's no better way for him to demonstrate his strength than these rhetorical flourishes that he's pushing. That's probably an alternative interpretation of what's going on.
Okay, before I go to Dickson, I wanted to add another to this conversation. We're now joined by Fazlin Fransman, who is the senior researcher at the Mojo Research Institute, who's joining us now from Cape Town. Fazlin, thanks for joining us here in Scope. Fazlin, what do you make of China's growing power around the world, be it via the BRI initiative or other such initiatives, and in the context of this trade war? Because China's saying, listen, we're going to be able to weather this. We obviously do not want a trade war, but we can weather this, and we've been reaching out to other partners around the world. What do you make of that?
Well, I think you touched on a very valid point around the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a key element of Chinese foreign policy, and it is a key part of their internal strategy to kind of lift their population out of poverty. So I think it's a key component. And when we look at the tariffs imposed by the US government, we have to see China's internal dynamics within that context. So, for example, President Xi Jinping has stated emphatically that within the next 5 years, he wants to elevate the entire population out of poverty. And that has been, sort of his goal since he's taken over as the head of the Communist Party. And I think this tariffs that is being imposed on China is actually, perhaps going to cripple their, agenda. And so I think, so that's one element. And I think the other element is and perhaps why China has walked away from the table in terms of discussions is specifically that the trade deals proposed by the United States actually doesn't benefit the internal dynamics and the internal agenda of what China is trying to achieve for its internal population, and that requires a greater output. So for example, to elevate, the mass population of China out of poverty, they need the manufacturing sector to do that. And when we have these massive tariffs that are imposed upon them, in actual fact, the net effect on these companies is that they would have to charge more for their products, or they would have to lay off workers because they just can't make ends meet. So I think it's a very difficult scenario for China that they find themselves in. But it is and completely understandable in terms of their response to the suggestions put forward by the United States in terms of a trade agreement.
Okay, so Dickson, I wonder what you make of what Fazlin said, and I wanted to add this on in the context of the U.S. What's being said by Chinese exporters is that they're going to pass on the costs, and obviously there will be additional costs. Those will be passed on to U.S. consumers. So in fact, it'll be U.S. consumers will be paying more for whatever Chinese products they may be using. And then obviously on the other side, then we have American farmers also going to be suffering, especially when it comes to the issue of soybeans. And that's apparently one of the most valuable U.S. agricultural export crops, especially to China. What do you make of that, Dickson?
First off, China isn't walking away from the table. If you follow the discussion from Liu He as of this Friday in Washington, he has stated also emphatically that the discussions will continue in principle. And it's not the first time that they've seen Trump basically display real estate speculators sort of like negotiation tactics. So there is no walking away from the table. And the second thing is that the net impact of the tariffs in China right now, given my sources in Beijing and so on, is that you do have a significant slowdown. That is true. But what you have is a situation where the net exports to the other industrialized OECD markets and the lift that comes out from the AIIB, as well as the Belt and Road signing on an additional vast number of like new members, means that it's not going to bite as hard as some analysts say it's going to bite. And the third thing is, if you look at the net amount which the U.S. exports to China, one of the trump cards that he has on hand is the fact that, I mean, simply speaking, there isn't just so many exports in terms of like actual products to China in the first place. What the U.S. does have is a giant surplus in terms of services, financial services, banking, legal, and so on. And those are the ones which will really sort of like cut if like this trade war escalates. So there's quite a lot of like, for lack of a better term, fog of war in terms of some of these figures. If you actually have to sit down and analyze the net impact, what we're looking at is it's more like in terms of its scare tactic. It's the scare factor to the financial market that really hits you in the gut. And you have a situation where the U.S. is coming out of a sugar high from the sort of like tax cuts that Trump initiated ever since he came in. I think that there's a lot of speculation in the U.S. media that the reason why Trump has actually suddenly hardened his position is A, because the Chinese have simply walked away or reversed some of the commitments that they've made with regards to the trade talks, especially with regards to industrial policy and the sort of like favoring of domestic SOEs.
Just because we're running out of time, Dickson, I do apologize for cutting you off there, but we're running out of time to give the final word back to you, Fazlin. Politically, if we may just very quickly speak about geopolitics around the world, there are a number of key areas where China and the U.S. disagree on. I can talk about the Iran nuclear deal, China saying it still wants to buy Iranian oil to an extent. There are possibly other areas around the world where they disagree on tactics, maybe when it comes to North Korea especially also. Do you think that a lot of that is playing out into these trade talks?
Yeah, I think actually if you look at the tariffs specifically, I think the tariffs is an element of a bigger conversation that is taking place. I think the tariffs is if you think of it in the traditional donkey and the carrot and the stick, I think the tariffs is the stick trying to force China back to the table to get them to agree to the concessions that the US wants with regard specifically to the technology sector. And I think this is sometimes, the nuanced conversation that is missed in analysis around the China-US trade conversation, that it's often masks just within the concept of tariffs, but it's actually the bigger conversation of the tech industry that China is starting to dominate, and that poses a major threat to the U.S. dominance, in various sectors, and it affects, for example, if you bring it home from an African continent perspective, it affects the U.S.-China relations with Africa. There is definitely a geopolitical battle for dominance within the tech sector, with regards to China and the U.S. And I think the United States notes that. So if you look at their foreign policy position on Africa, for example, it is very much based on countering Chinese influence on Africa, which is very different to previous administrations' positions, on the African continent. So I think that there's definitely a bigger power play, that the tariffs really is the stick to try and get China to agree to, for example, some of the concessions that the United States wants, and that's specifically related to the technology sector. I think the bigger conversation, for example, on Huawei is actually a major sticking point, within these trade conversations, because it speaks to the advanced technology that China ultimately, is likely to provide to the entire world. And the question really is the United States comfortable with that level of dominance. And I think that's the bigger conversation that possibly should be taking place as well.
Indeed, and you're completely right about that, Fazlin. We're going to leave that as a final. I'm glad you brought up the tech war or the global tech dominance now of China. We know Huawei is doing much better than even Apple is now. So let me thank our guests from the top. We were joined by Fazlin Fransman, senior researcher at the Mojo Research Institute. She was speaking to us from Cape Town. We were also earlier joined by Winnie King, who is lecturer in East Asian political economy and international relations at the University of Bristol. We were also joined by Wong Shun, who is the editor-in-chief of the Oxford Political Review. And finally, Dickson, who is doctoral fellow at George Washington University's Sigur Center of Asia. He was speaking to us from Washington on the line. Now, guests, all of our guests, I should say viewers, spoken about a number of facets to this issue, but it's also really about who is most affected by this trade war. And obviously, the arguments can go back and forth about that, but it's also then about Trump's style of negotiating. And maybe we're all reading a bit too much into this rhetoric. Maybe down the line in a week's time, or in a few days' time, or in a few hours' time. You never know with Trump. He may just tweet something completely different from what he has been saying so far when it comes to the trade talks. What we know for sure right now is that tariffs will go up. That will take some time, by the way, to bring to the fore. That will not, from what I've understood at least, happen immediately, but it will be more than double on upwards of $200 billion of Chinese imports into the U.S. Then apart from that, there are the political aspects to this. Many areas around the world where the Chinese and Americans disagree. Is that playing out more into this? And then the tech issue, as Fazlin there correctly pointed out, is this also just about the U.S. trying to protect its companies versus Chinese companies, which are growing in dominance in technology around the world? We'll keep a very close eye on that story and how it develops going forward here in Scope. But thanks for watching. I've been Waqar Rizvi.